How is everyone today?
Very good.
Better say okay, a beautiful day like this. Nothing wrong with this weather. This is, before I get started here, before someone has any questions as to why this shirt, yeah, I'm sure maybe that. I had to, at Norwalk Community College, and I do this every semester, there is a literature course. And each week is a different person giving a talk on a different book. Today was my turn. And the topic today was, and I've read the book more than once, was The Hound of the Baskervilles. That's what I was doing today. And the first time I did this course, I did the Maltese Falcon. So I wore the shirt, but I didn't have time to go home. I mean, I had to cut that class at 2:30 to get over here. So I didn't have time to change so that's why I'm still in this, the Maltese, which is my favorite detective story anyway. It's a great story. The book's even better than the movie, if you can believe that. But that's why the shirt, so.
Is that a regular NCC class or lifetime learners?
It's lifetime learners. But so they do this every semester. So they pick somebody to come. So it was my turn today. I mean, I've done the Maltese Falcon, I did the Time Machine, I did Lost Horizons. Today was Hound of the Baskervilles, and I did a Walk in the Sun too. That's a good story.
Is it part of a course?
Yes.
What is the course? What's the course?
I love to read. It's literature.
Oh, yeah. Oh.
And it's next spring too?
Yes. Oh, they'll have it next spring. In fact, I'll probably get the email, what are you going to do in the spring? And I don't know yet. So I'd like to do Animal House, but they did that now. Somebody else did that not long ago. So we'll see. But that's why the shirt. And my oldest son got this for me because he knows I like this story. So I figured, today's the day to wear it. So anyway, this is today is the third of 4 women that is being done with this series. Harriet Tubman, Susan B. Anthony we did last week. Amelia Earhart is the last. She's next week. And I was asked by a couple of people, what happened to Eleanor Roosevelt? Eleanor Roosevelt was a standalone. That was another week, so you're going to want to repeat it. And so today is Helen Keller, who is, again, she is another one coming along after Harriet Tubman and Susan B. Anthony, born much later, 1880, who really is really 1880, who is really a fascinating character here, who is an example of what you can overcome and then achieve. She really is. And that's what we're going to get into. And I'm going to get into some of the politics she got involved with because I find it fascinating. And every time it seems they talk about Helen Keller, they kind of leave out her political agenda here. Her and Mark Twain, they were buddies, by the way. And you're going to see how she becomes acquainted with Alexander Graham Bell, Charlie Chaplin. And this lady will know or get to know or even just be acquainted with every president from Grover Cleveland to Lyndon B. Johnson. See, that's quite a stretch. That's quite a stretch. But she's actually born June 27, 1880 in Tuscumbia, Alabama. Her father is an Arthur Keller. He is the editor of the North Alabamian. Not a huge newspaper, but he's the editor of it. Her father was also at one point a captain in the Confederate Army during the war between the states. Or if you're from the South, I'll placate you, the War of Northern Aggression. Her mother, Kate Adams Keller, from Massachusetts originally. Her father, Charles Keller, Charles Adams, was actually a colonel in the Confederate Army, breveted to a brigadier general. Interesting how that comes to be. From Massachusetts, fought from the side of the Confederates. And so and she has from the Keller side of the family ties to family roots in Switzerland. Actually, an antecedent here was actually a doctor for the deaf. She never knows him, but he was a doctor of the deaf. However, when Helen Keller is born, she can see and she can hear. She wasn't born blind or deaf. Now, supposedly, at age 19 months, she was afflicted with ailments that attacked her stomach and her brain, which some doctors say was either scarlet fever and or meningitis, and left her without the faculties of sight and hearing at 19 months. Now, it's fascinating how the human condition can acclimate itself to certain, we'll call them deficiencies. And after the dust settles, you know, that she can't see, she can't hear, that the Keller family has a cook and a maid in the house. The woman's last name is Washington. She has a daughter who's 6 years old who is able, in a rudimentary fashion, able to communicate with Helen. And the daughter's name is Martha Washington. That's the daughter's name. And so as Helen begins to mature here, 2 years old, 3 years old, 4 years old, again, some senses become really acute here. People walking into a room, the vibrations, she's able to eventually pick up whether it's a male or a female. She's beginning to be able to tell whether that person is older or younger. And as certain footfalls become she begins to get these footfalls on a regular basis, she knows who it is. She knows who it is. And it's interesting, again, how the human condition acclimates to certain drawbacks. And as we go on here, Kate Adams Keller reads a story by Dickens about a lady named Laura Bridgman who was blind and deaf and went to school and to learn. And so, interesting what she urges her husband to do. She urges her husband to take Helen to a doctor. This is 1886. She's 6 years old. And they go see this doctor, Dr. J. Julian Chisholm, who's an eye, ear, and nose specialist in Baltimore. And he, by the way, sends them on to somebody else who's opened an institute in studying people who are blind and deaf, and that was Alexander Graham Bell. That's interesting. That's interesting. And so from there, they're sent back to Massachusetts, South Boston, the Putnam Institute for the Deaf. And she meets Michael Agnanos, who in turn, after in an interview, assigns a young lady who's 20 years old to help Helen Keller. And this will begin a 49-year relationship. And that was Anne Sullivan. Anne Sullivan will go back to the Keller residence in March 1887. And this begins that. And keep in mind, the first thing Anne Sullivan does for this young lady is buy her a doll. Now, it's nice to be friendly, open up a relationship, but there's more to it than that. It's the beginning of the therapy here. And she begins to communicate with Helen that this is a doll. And she begins to teach Helen how to spell. Take a finger, take an open hand, doll. D-O-L-L. Now it opens the floodgates. How do you spell cat? How do you spell dog? And so on and so forth. She develops this very exquisite use of touch. Say with animals, dogs, cats. And even though she can't see and can't hear, she would run her hand from the nose to the tail. Well, this is a dog. This is a cat. Whatever the case may be. Education is beginning here. But don't be misled. This Anne Sullivan had a tough time here. Because this is a young child who does not have the faculties of other children. They have her ability to endure this and then develop into the person she's going to be takes a lot of work. This is a tough road to hoe here. A very tough road to hoe. And by And by 1888, as Helen Keller is growing up, she winds up at the Putnam Institute for the Deaf. She will then wind up in a place in 1894. She will eventually go to New York, and she will attend the Wright Humanin School of the Deaf, and later on the Horace Mann Institute. And then by 1896, she's back in Massachusetts going to the Cambridge School for Young Ladies. This is the last step toward Radcliffe College in 1900. Keep in mind, when she gets to Radcliffe College, one of her ardent admirers, and she's getting to be known already, is Mark Twain. He, in turn, introduces her to Henry Huddleston Rogers. Henry Huddleston Rogers is an executive with Standard Oil. So obviously he has some money here. And Mr. Rogers and his wife, Abby, will foot the tuition bill for Helen Keller's 4 years at Radcliffe College. Keep in mind, Helen Keller has already written a book called The Frost King when she was 11 years old. She's on her way to writing already. She's developing her faculties to communicate beyond those with a lack of sight and a lack of hearing here. Deaf, being blind and deaf, she's beginning to communicate outside these restrictions. She will graduate in 1904. She will receive a Bachelor of Arts degree. She is the first deaf blind person to do so. Interesting what's coming down the pike here. This young lady begins to develop as a speaker. Now, keep in mind, she's going to take voice lessons, voice therapy, because she can't hear what she's saying. In the beginning, it's interesting. She had this exquisite use of touch. She would go up to you, another person, and lightly touch your lips as you're talking, and she can read lips. It's like reading Braille. She used to be able to, if there was a machine playing music on a table, lightly put her fingertips on the table or the desktop, whichever it is, and be able to get the vibrations to understand the music. Wow. Fascinating what you're seeing here develop with this person. She begins to give talks here, going into 1904, 1906. And by 1916, and Anne Sullivan is with her, by the way. In 1916, they wind up in Menominee, Wisconsin. And she gives a talk here, which is absolutely fascinating here. In fact, the local newspaper, the Dunn County News, a message of optimism, of hope, of good cheer, and of loving service was brought to Menominee Saturday. A message that will linger for those fortunate enough to have received it. This message came with the visit of Helen Keller, her teacher. Keep in mind, Anne Sullivan is married now, Mrs. John Macy. She married a fellow by the name of John Macy. And both had a hand in imparting it Saturday evening to a splendid audience filled the memorial. But this message of happiness, and she's beginning to really become a social activist here. How we should have a better regard for one another, how we should be able to help one another. At the same time, being a spokesman for people who are blind and people who are deaf. In fact, her speech in January 1916 was reprinted and put in the newspapers in Wisconsin in January 2016. The long reach of history here. Long reach of history. Anne Sullivan, longtime companion, married John Macy in 1906. However, by 1914, she falls ill. Another person is added to the entourage here. Polly Thompson. Polly Thompson is a Scottish lady who had no experience with people who were blind and people who were deaf. She's taken on as the housekeeper / cook. She will later become Helen Keller's personal secretary. But keep in mind, there's a short-term development here. As she's taken on, as Polly Thompson is taken on as the housekeeper / the cook, a man is taken on while Anne Sullivan is sick. His name is Peter Fagan. He was a journalist from the Boston Herald. And the two actually, for a short time here, fall in love. And there was a possibility of them getting married. It doesn't work. The family was against this, and it doesn't work. However, she will remain unmarried, Helen Keller. And so, interesting here that this Peter Fagan fell in love with her. But it doesn't work out. And as far as Anne Sullivan goes, Anne Sullivan will die in 1936. And she will die with Helen Keller holding one of her hands as she dies. Interesting here. It's really fascinating. Helen Keller, by the way, as a spokesperson for somebody, for people who have such disabilities as blindness and deafness, will at one point travel to 25 countries to give talks and lectures. Some of these lectures, were recorded and are in the National Archives and Records Administration, NARA, if you're familiar with that. They have all sorts of records of American history. But keep in mind one thing, some were lost on September 11, 2001, when the Twin Towers went down. And so there is some still remain, but some were lost because NARA had records in that complex. And so once the terrorists made their attacks, some of the records here were lost. Yes?
You spoke of her being able to communicate through speech.
Right.
People who are deaf from birth, some do learn how to speak, but it's total monotone. Being that Helen Keller did not lose her hearing until she was a toddler, but still.
Right.
Did she have any cadence at all to her speaking voice? Was it something that she was able to develop? Or it was, again, that the ability to speak, but totally one pitch?
Well, keep in mind, as she's developing as a public speaker, she took voice lessons, therapy, and she was coached to the point where she's a fairly interesting speaker, but she's coached. She just didn't develop this on her own, which was an intelligent thing to do. But do people, again, as I mentioned, it's intriguing how people with such disabilities, their other senses come alive. I mean, for instance, my father-in-law is an example. He's deaf in one, although my father-in-law is 94, the other ear is going too. It's not going to be long before he's not going to be able to hear a stitch. But he was totally deaf in one ear since he was 14. And the reason for that was, well, you've had kids. Gee, don't run around the house. How many times have you said that, right? Do kids listen? I know I didn't. Dad's gone. Let's run around the house. And so my father-in-law, him and his brother, were running up. They used to live in New Canaan during the Depression. They were running up the stairs, and the house wasn't that big, so the stairway is kind of going up the stairs is kind of crowded. And they bumped and they fell running up the stairs. Well, my father-in-law's brother had a pencil in his shirt. Yeah, and the pencil went into the ear, right through the eardrum, destroyed the eardrum. And the point broke off, so now the lead's in his head. And my father-in-law always made a joke about it. Yeah, I got to go upstairs and get the lead out. But all of a sudden, his equilibrium was off. He's dizzy. But that's not the point. The point here is he learned how to read lips. He learned how to read lips. And so sometimes they live with us. So sometimes at the dinner table, my wife will go, Dad, Dad, Dad. You don't have to yell, I can read lips. Or it's even worse, and it drives my mother-in-law crazy. Well, she's losing her hearing too. But, you know, my father-in-law, when he goes to bed, he sleeps on the good ear. And I can hear it. John! She begins to, you know, what do you want? Because I told my father-in-law, I said, is there a reason you sleep on your good ear? And he goes, no comment. But people do develop this extrasensory perception, if you want to call it that, or other ways of communicating. And for my father-in-law, or understanding of my father-in-law, it's reading lips. And he was pretty proficient at this. He still is. Yes?
Wouldn't the fact that she didn't become deaf and blind until she was, say, 18 months or whatever, that would give her she would have developed certain sounds and interest, and she must have babbled or spoken at that point. So that certainly would have helped to lead her in the right direction.
Yeah, and plus kids are pretty malleable.
No, but, you know, if you've heard words,
Right,
it's got to be retained in your brain somewhere.
right.
So
That's a head start, so to speak?
Pardon?
It's a head start, so to speak?
Yeah.
Could be. That's a pretty interesting, intriguing point. But yeah, but then again, you're almost, except for maybe that, you're almost starting from scratch.
Yeah,
Which-
but you've got the hearing. I mean, it's like if I were to hear German when I was a baby,
Right.
I might have been able to get some of the hucks in there, which I can't.
Right.
But, you know, I'm used to hearing English.
Right.
So my ear for other languages doesn't do that. But I think that when you're like a sponge, you must get something like that. And seeing, she must have had an idea of what colors were and what the world was.
Well, I mean, children themselves can be sponges, especially in the right atmosphere.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, like, I might have mentioned in a different talk, I told my wife, well, why do we want to leave People magazine on the living room table? Why don't you leave a U.S. News and World Report? Or instead of Us magazine, how about National Geographic? You know, it's the power of suggestion here. And once these kids pick these things up, especially like a National Geographic, it's informative, but aren't there a lot of color pictures here? The maps. What about the maps in a National Geographic? And I'm a big one on that, so I go over these things with my granddaughter here, my granddaughters. And so, yeah, are you seeing the same sort of thing with Helen Keller here? Yeah, you are. And she's gravitating more toward the intellectual here. She's gravitating more toward the intellectual. And that brings up her politics. Helen Keller, she is a fascinating personality at this stage, going beyond her being blind and deaf, her politics. She was an ardent socialist, ardent pacifist, vehement anti-war, was not a supporter of Woodrow Wilson. Her and Mark Twain, very popular American historical characters, yet their politics are kind of marginalized when people talk about them. Interesting what Helen Keller herself says about this, about her political activities. At one point, a Rockefeller-controlled newspaper, periodicals, no longer covered her. And she complained until they began to publish commentaries written by her or some of her speeches. But one in particular sticks out here. A paper called the Brooklyn Eagle. Helen Keller claimed that the newspaper columnist who had praised her courage and intelligence before she expressed her socialist views now called attention to her disabilities. The editor of the Brooklyn Eagle wrote that, and this is in quotes, mistakes sprung out of manifest limitations of her development. Ouch. Keller responded to the editor, referring to having met him before he knew of her political views. And this is what she states. At that time, compliments he paid me were so generous that I blush to remember them. But now that I have come out for socialism, He reminds me and the public that I am blind and deaf, and especially liable to error. I must have shrunk in intelligence during the years since I met him. And then she writes, "Oh, ridiculous Brooklyn Eagle, itself socially blind and deaf. It defends an intolerable system, a system that is the cause of much of the physical blindness and deafness which we are trying to prevent." And one of the things she does with a George Kessler in 1915, the Helen Keller Institute, which is by the Helen Keller International, which is devoted to research to vision, health, and nutrition. She's a firm believer that nutrition is the cause of much physical ailments, drawbacks, sickness, whatever the case may be. How many of your doctors here are nutritionists? This lady's talking about this in 1915. She's also convinced that women, and she's an ardent socialist. She supports socialism. She writes numerous articles from 1909 to 1921. In fact, by the way, she read Henry George's book, Progress and Poverty. So she became a committed socialist. And interesting what she says here about America at this point. This is 1911. "The few own the many because they possess the means of livelihood of all. The country is governed for the richest, for the corporations, the bankers, the land speculators, and exploiters of labor." She's saying this before Noam Chomsky's even born, for Pete's sakes. "The majority of mankind are working people. So long as their fair demands, the ownership and control of their livelihoods are set at naught, we can neither have men's rights nor women's rights. The majority of mankind is ground down by industrial oppression in order that the small remnant may live in ease." Now that's an interesting assessment of her time. That's 1911. Wow. How many times do you see that written about this lady? This is what never. That's what she says. This is what she says. This is what she says. She joins the international workers of the world, known also as the Wobblies. She is one of the founding members. Get this. She's one of the founding members of the ACLU. Boy, there's a lot going on here with this lady. But consider the time between, let's say, 1900 and 1920. Some of this is the lead up to what? The First World War. Socialism was resonating with a number of people here. Eugene Debs. She'll campaign for him every time he ran for president. Interesting. It's really fascinating, this lady. Wow. What's going on here? And she still gets involved with talking about people and their disability. Physical, mental disabilities, whatever the case may be. She's also in favor of eugenics. She's for birth control. She's a big practitioner of women's health because she even states here. Interesting how she states this. This is her activism with regards to women's health. "I was appointed on a commission to investigate the conditions of the blind," and match this up with her political affiliations with socialism and the international workers of the world. She combines the two. People's deficiencies versus social activism, political activism. "For the first time, I who had thought that blindness a misfortune beyond human control, found that too much of it was traceable to wrong industrial conditions." Christmas, she sounds like Naomi Klein. often caused by the selfishness and greed of employers. And the social evil contributed its share. I found that poverty drove women to a life of shame that ended in blindness. Here she's alluding to what? Prostitution, eventually what? Syphilis? Doesn't syphilis sometimes lead to blindness? That's what she's saying. Now go back to her Helen Keller International research and trying to find answers to loss of sight, and also involved with nutrition. But she was also for birth control. Now, I'm not going to tell you she was interested in abortions. That's not the point. The point here is responsible sex education, so on and so forth. That's where she's sitting. In other words, this is all part of her social activism. But as a world-renowned speaker, talking about blindness and deafness, you know, she goes to like 25 different countries. She's all over the place, this lady. And well-renowned. Well-renowned. Yes?
Hundreds of years prior, and the countries she visited during her journeys were rife with scurvy and rickets and other ailments that are caused by nutrition, which lead to brain undevelopment,
Correct.
loss of vision, especially carotene, vitamin C, soft bones, which only hinder the process. So she was right there.
Well, this lady is at this point, at this time, where there is, in fact, we were talking before about before this started. I was talking to one person here was talking to you about the slavery and what to do with the blacks. Even though there were abolitionists in this country that didn't like the institution of slavery, well, we don't want them here. We'll send them back to Africa. That was some of the mentality. And yet, what is Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton saying? No. Freedom for everybody. Man, white, man, woman, black, white, who cares? Young, old, whatever the case may be. Everybody should be educated. Everybody should have the same opportunities here. Everyone, equal opportunity here. It makes no difference who or what you are. And yet, the mindset was, okay, well, let's free them, but let's get rid of this institution, but let's, send them back to Africa. Well, Helen Keller, she believes in the inequalities and iniquities of capitalism can be solved by socialism, being socially responsible for your fellow man. That's how she thinks. Is that much different than what Susan B. Anthony was saying? Not really. Not really at all. Only unlike Susan B. Anthony, she'll see the 1920 right to vote. Well, she'll experience it. Interesting. And so she delivers these messages repeatedly. In fact, later on, she will write. Let me get the name of the books here. Yes. She will write about 12 books, But she writes a book in 1908, The World I Live In, giving readers an insight into how she felt about the world in 1908. And she follows this up with a book called Out of the Dark, now that's an interesting title, Out of the Dark. And what is that book? Essays on Socialism. This is quite a person here. This is not only somebody who's coming out of the dark, this one's an intellectual. In other words, she's using God's greatest gift, a brain. Religious, you could say anything you want. The greatest thing God gave you was a brain. That knowledge box we don't use sometimes. Basically, that's what she's doing here. Overcoming any impediments she has by thinking. That's a novel concept, isn't it? Fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. One of the countries she goes to and she's fairly popular here, is Japan, even in the 1930s, as they are moving more and more irrevocably to the right. Fascist government developing, a militarist government. The Japanese government didn't launch that invasion of Manchuria in 1931. The Japanese army did without sanction of the government. That shows you where this country's going. But somebody like a Helen Keller resonates here to the point where in 1936 they'll give her a dog, an Akita. She fell in love with Akita dogs because she thought they were a wonderful companion. Of course, keep in mind 1936, she's lost Anne Sullivan. So does the dog come in? Yes. Yes. She has Polly Thompson, yes. But, you know, the dog, constant companion, faithful, and she always... And when the dog died, a year later, the Japanese government gave her another one. And this is a country that's already invaded, now China, in 1937. A government by assassination. And yet, Helen Keller resonates here. Fascinating story here. Intriguing, this lady. Very intriguing. You know, she's still giving lectures, but of course, by, you know, as the 40s blends into the 50s here, Polly Thompson, another one of her lifelong competitors from 1914, suffers a stroke. And they take on another lady here who will try to pick up the slack, and that's a Winnie Cobley. And Polly Thompson will die in 1960, and Corbally will be Helen Keller's companion until she in turn dies in 1968, June 1st, 1968. But she also suffers a stroke too in 1961. And she will be given the Presidential Medal of Freedom by Lyndon B. Johnson in 1964. And in 1965, she will be awarded Medal of Freedom, actually. In 1965, she will be awarded at the New York World's Fair. But she will die in 1968, on June 1st, 1968. And in 1971, Alabama, where she was born, would put her into the Alabama State's Hall of Fame as an individual. She will, in 2015, when they open this up, she will be one of the 12 first inductees into the Alabama Writers Hall of Fame. Not just as a woman, as a writer. And of course, she dies in Connecticut, Arcan Ridge in Easton, Connecticut. In fact, if you, I think it's Route 59, I think it is, if you get off the Merritt Parkway, go up 59, you pass the Helen Keller Middle School. But there is a lot going on here with this lady as far as a social activist and politically. And that kind of gets lost in the shuffle here when they talk about her or write about her. It's like same thing with Mark Twain. It's expunged from the narrative, if you want to use that term. I mean, read Mark Twain's stories here. A lot of socially conscious messages coming out of these stories. Yes?
Did she, through her ideas and her writings, have any influence in the later to be of the American Act of Disabled?
Yeah, I think so. I didn't.
That's the 70s.
Right. I mean, keep in mind this lady too. After she dies in '68, but in 1999, she will be on that Gallup poll as one of the most popular, most influential Americans of the 20th century. And so that's 31 years after she dies. Like Eleanor Roosevelt, she died in '62, and yet in 1999, she will make a poll of one of the most influential Americans of the 20th century.
How would you succinctly,
That still resonates with a different generation here.
how would you qualify her achievements in one short?
Stupendous. To come up with a word right away? Yeah.
Not necessarily a word, but I mean, she was a pioneer in her own rights.
Well, I guess for people who are blind and deaf, I mean, it shows that they have a place in society too, to perhaps even change society, whether it's socially, politically, whatever the case may be. And in fact here, where is it here? I mean, there's been a number of movies done on her. I mean, you know, The Miracle Worker, so on and so forth. Yeah, she was, that's just a little picture here. It's just a small one. She was at the Alexander Graham Bell School of Vocal Physiology and Mechanics of Speech. Alexander Graham Bell got into this. And he was another one. Had a wide range of interests here. But she went here with Anne Sullivan. Anne Sullivan was with her almost every step of the way. Constant companion. But as I said in the beginning, that was a rocky start. So you got to give Anne Sullivan a lot of credit here. You really do. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question. What do you think the reasons for her political activism? I think that is really not.
Yeah.
It's kind of like an undercurrent. I mean, she was, a woman. Maybe that's the reason. I don't know.
That's part of it.
Yeah.
Becoming a...
You don't even hear about it yet.
No, but taking away being blind or deaf, I mean, this woman is taking up the cause of Harriet Tubman. Well, maybe this isn't said, but Harriet Tubman and Susan B. Anthony just running with it. She's the next step on the way, so she's blind and deaf, so what? But she's actually, and she becomes very socially conscious, and keep in mind, at this stage of America's development, we're already the world's #1 economic power. The factory system. Read Upton Sinclair's book about the jungle, about the meat packing plants. You read that book, you'll never want to eat a sausage again. I mean, them sweeping up the meat scraps and just making the sausage anyway, off the floor. And these animals have pooped on the floor, urinated. Oh, okay, who cares? And that leads to a crackdown on the meat packers. A book, well, because of Upton Sinclair, who, by the way, during the First World War, will be arrested for reading the Bill of Rights in public. Yeah. And so, go back over now to Helen Keller. This is a lady who feels that these are injustices that need to be reversed. And if we're going to have a successful society, we darn better well know how to live together. It makes no difference, black or white. Well, how about people with disabilities? I mean, keep in mind, Harriet Tubman and Susan B. Anthony are women's rights, rights of color, ability to vote. Okay, that's fine, but now you've thrown someone else in the mix who's concerned with that, but now disabilities. And somebody like this really sticks out like a beacon, especially when you get into this thing about eugenics, and then the Nazis are going to take this and move on with it. You know what that's going to lead to. But even here, her concern is, keep in mind, in 1909, this state, the state of Connecticut, was one of the first states to pass, what do they call it when they, the word's on the tip of my tongue. Help me here. Hints. Trying to make sure people, the birth strain isn't carried on here.
Eugenics?
No, it's based off that.
Sterilization.
Sterilization. There it is. Sterilization. This state passed sterilization here. We did, Virginia did, California did, Indiana did. Those were 4 of the first states. In fact, between 1909 and like 1960, we're going to sterilize some 60,000 people in the state. People who were considered mental incompetents. People who are considered, maybe criminals, we don't want that strain to continue. Well, who gave you the right to do that? Eliminating, as along the line, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes made a reference, eliminating certain idiots along those lines. And now you fast forward to the Nuremberg trials, guess what was some of the Nazi defendants? Well, look what America did. Look what America did. Interesting here. Interesting here. So you take somebody like this, is in direct opposite what some of these states are going to do here. Sterilization. We don't want these idiots procreating. Criminals, we don't want them They had I think 6 centers in this state doing that. And it was in favor by some people. Really was. Now, we don't want the mentally incompetent reproducing here, so let's sterilize them. Remember that scene in the movie Nuremberg with Montgomery Clift? That was a powerful scene, him having been sterilized because he wasn't mentally with it. Yes? This is what this lady was against, things like this, things of this nature. Yes?
If you take a look at the South in the 1800s, and the North as well, but obviously if you take a look at places like Austria-Hungary, Russia, you had all this inbreeding because they were only marrying each other's cousins. And a lot of the feeble-mindedness came from this constant intimate...
Well, this interbreeding.
Yeah, the interbreeding.
Right. And so when look at many of the royal families in Europe.
The Romanovs.
Well, yeah. Some of these royal families, some of these people weren't the sharpest tools in the shed. Some of these people, the elevator doesn't go to the top floor.
There is no top.
But there's a reason for this. And so, but what Helen Keller is talking about here is the industrialization of America and many people living in squalor or worse, and they don't have the money for being properly cared for. They're not properly educated. And so when you have poor nutrition, poor education, poor opportunities, what happens to some of these people? Well, yeah, they get sick. Women get into prostitution, get syphilis, they go blind, whatever the case may be. Whatever the case may be. And she's against that. And so she stands like a beacon for this. And because why? She's the poster child expression. I was blind and deaf, and look what I'm doing here. And she doesn't have to say that, but she's the example, the overt example here. So should this be celebrated? Yeah, by all means. By all means. By all means.
Is the Institute still functioning, the Helen Keller Institute? And have there been graduates with notes that have come out since this educational philosophy came to be?
Yeah, that's a good question. I honestly don't know. I didn't pursue that end of this. But that's a good question. Look that up. Yeah. So there were people besides herself who supported this, looking for a better country. But her political views, she supported Eugene Debs every time he ran for president. He always lost, but she supported him every time he ran. So she put her money where her mouth was. Exactly what she did. There again is a role model. Being a role model. Putting your money where your mouth is. And so, again, I can imagine if she was around today what she'd say. Interesting if some of these people could be around today, they'll lend observation to what they see. Yeah? Yes?
The Miracle Worker, I think, portrayed her as a little girl at the time when she met Anne Sullivan.
Right.
She's really a wild child. Do you think that's an exaggeration, or...?
I think that's somewhat of an exaggeration. I don't think she was a wild child, but she was difficult to work with. Well, that's understandable.
Sure.
By the time you're 6 or 7, you're beginning to realize here, I don't have some of the faculties normal children have. And is that going to weigh on her personality? Yeah, you're darn right it is. And is that going to make it tough on Anne Sullivan? Yeah, it will. Which is why I mentioned earlier, you got to give Anne Sullivan a lot of credit here. Now, could she have tantrums and stuff? Sure. But I mean, was she climbing the walls all the time? No, I think that's kind of a stretch. You know, I mean, some movies are gonna embellish to sell the product here. You know, we've seen this in movies before. I always remember that movie Patton, where George C. Scott jumps out the window and pulls his little pistol out and is shooting at those German planes, and the bullets go between his legs. I mean, come on here, you know. So they like to embellish a little bit here. It's a good movie, but you know. No. Anyway. Anybody have? Oh yeah, next week we do Amelia Earhart, which is I gave that talk last week over at the Fairfield Senior Center last Thursday night, and there was a lady there who was 96 years old who flew with her.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and she lives in Easton. Yeah, amazing is right. And so she got to know, and that's her lifelong hero, no doubt. Interesting little lady. She's pretty good for 96. And yeah. So that was a nice surprise to see that.
So after next week, will you be back at the library for another?
Yeah, I'm doing another 4-week series after Amelia Earhart.
Will it continue, or will you stop and then start again?
No, I'm starting a new series after Amelia Earhart, doing the Russian Revolution.
And will that start
Immediately?
immediately?
Immediately right after.
Thank you. That was-
So today was Helen Keller. Next week is Amelia Earhart. The week after that, the Russian Revolution, because it's 100 years. So, and women have a part in that too, which is forgotten. So I'll get into that a little bit. So, but she was a fascinating character. She really was. Helen Keller, that is. Helen Keller. Thank you. Anybody else have any questions or comments? No? That's it. We're done.